Ladies and gentlemen, we've now moved to our Q&A segment this evening, and I wanted to say a few things about the rules. The system will be that each of the teams has submitted to me 2 questions for each other, and I will read the first question from the affirmative team for the negative team, and then proceed with the opposite way around. Thereafter, there will be an opportunity for people who want to ask questions to come down to the microphone beside me and ask questions. So you can, in fact, begin to line up if you wish to fairly shortly. There are some rules that the teams, as I say, have agreed before the debate. The opportunity, as I say, the purpose of this debate is to promote an exchange of ideas and to test ideas. Therefore, what we would like from questioners is a question, not a speech. I don't want to have to solemnly look at that camera and say, I'll take that as a comment. What we want are questions that are directed to one or other teams or one of the speakers, but that are designed to elucidate the thinking of the speakers or designed to test the thinking of the speakers. The other rule that is of importance is that though it is reasonable, more than reasonable, the purpose of this debate is to test ideas, we want the questions asked in a reasonably civil manner, by which I mean any form of personal attack is absolutely out. Obviously, questioning, even firm questioning of ideas, is firmly permissible. What will then happen is that the person to whom the question is directed will be given a reasonable time for response. Obviously, ask them to be as succinct as they can be, and they'll be asked to wind up if they are not being succinct, and there will then be an opportunity for the opposing team to provide a short response. Those are the rules of engagements. So people within the audience who may wish to ask questions, could I invite you to begin to come down whenever you would like to, and just take direction from the organisers to my left. The first question for the negative team from the affirmative team is this. A sexual reproduction gives up to twice as much reproductive success for the same resources as sexual reproduction. How could sexual reproduction ever gain advantage to be selected? And how could mere physics and chemistry invent the complementary apparatuses needed at the same time when non-intelligent processes cannot plan for the future coordination of male and female organs? That's the question. Could we throw to the negative team for a response?
Is that on? Yep. So this is actually an interesting one. I've looked into this. So there are 2 sexes in most organisms. There's the whiptail lizard actually that changes back and forth. But I think the question you're kind of asking is why would sex evolve? And we know the answer to that. It increases genetic entropy. It actually has more likelihood of there being a success passed on, more likelihood of there being a fault passed on. There's actually a bacterial being that has 7 sexes, which, interestingly enough, they can have sex with each other, and that also increases their genetic entropy. So there's more likelihood of there being a successful gene passed on, basically, is the answer to that, I guess.
All right. Now, would the affirmative team like to make a response to what's been said? I'm sorry?
Is this on? Good. Yes, I'd just like to respond. I think what you're answering there is, Morgan, is why, but the question was how. The initial implied organism would have been a single-celled living organism capable of reproduction asexually. So somehow or other, between then and now, we have developed sexual reproduction. So the question relates to how.
Yes, Morgan?
Well, it probably happened early in life's development. We don't know. We are able to say those words, I guess, that we don't know occasionally. Some, yeah, as I said, some procreate differently than we do. And obviously there have been different evolutionary chains. As you probably know, there's the Y chromosome in humans and the X chromosome in all mammals, but there's the W chromosome in snakes and lizards. And as I mentioned earlier, the whiptail lizard actually doesn't have that W chromosome anymore to designate male. It just decides, or eventually, when it gets old enough, it becomes a male. It's female for the rest of its life. So it was just probably a random mutation that caused the 7 sexes in the bacteria and caused the 2 sexes in the bacteria that just luckily enough ended up to be us. It's easier to organise 2 sexes, obviously, than it is to organise 7, and that 2 gives you a little bit better chance of there being genetic mutations passed on.
But once again, that answered when, but not how.
I think I did answer how by saying genetic mutation.
But a mutation cannot lead to the incredible complexity of all the genetic information required to make male and female reproductive organs, which would have presumably taken millions of years to evolve, whilst asexual reproduction was still successfully continuing. So the question was how?
You don't know how either. You say God did it. How did God do it? What was the exact process that God used to do that? Did he do this part first and then this part first and this part? Like, you don't have any record of how God did it. We don't have any record of how it evolved because microorganisms eat each other. So bacteria ate the evidence, basically. So it might be that we can never know. But I'm quite comfortable with that, not knowing.
I guess what I'm pointing at is the impossibility of the naturalistic explanation for origins to count for sexual reproduction. And in fact, when you read the eyewitness account of history, it says that God created us at the beginning, male and female, which makes enormous sense because there is no other way in which those things could have just happened by naturalistic processes. So if naturalistic processes are impossible, that leads you to the conclusion that there must have been a creator God.
Mark, again, you told us why, but the question was how.
All right. Now I'll move to the next question. My colleague, the doctor, tells me that was a good answer. Could I move to the next question? The question for the affirmative team is this. Paul of Tarsus outlawed prostitution in 1 Corinthians 6:16 when prostitution was widespread. Why didn't he outlaw slavery since it was similarly widespread?
To answer this question, I'd just like to go back into the Old Testament because Nick did raise that up. And I think this is a really important issue in the Bible, a whole issue of slavery. It's interesting that the 10 Commandments actually commences with the introduction, I'm the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. And so effectively the very foundation of this morality is that God is freeing us from slavery. In particular, he's talking to the Israelites. And God would often remind the Hebrew nation that they'd once been enslaved and that he'd redeemed them out of this house of slavery. And he demonstrates that in the ancient Near East, slavery was a very common practice. But often when we think of slavery in the Old Testament, we think of African-American slaves being kidnapped and shipped across the Atlantic to the southern states of USA. However, in the Old Testament, it's much better described as what we'd call indentured servanthood, or actually more like employees of today. So what would happen was that a person might be in economical difficulties and they might need the economic support, the funding support. And what they would do is they would literally hire themselves out to a landowner or some other kind of person who would be able to provide them with work. Now, the Old Testament actually had laws that protected these indentured servants. So every 7th year, the Hebrew slave owners were to free, or servants, they were to free all of their indentured servants and let them go free. So, and also the laws that we have in the Old Testament is that kidnapping people and selling them into slavery was forbidden. and that Israelites were actually to protect runaway foreign slaves. So we have actually here, as Paul Copeland says, though Israel's laws on servitude wasn't the moral ideal, they show far greater moral sensitivity than other ancient Near Eastern texts. In doing so, they point us back to God's ideal at the beginning. All humans are God's image bearers. Now, when we move to the New Testament, which is where the question came from, we find Jesus giving his ministry mandate. It's an incredible ministry. It says, "The servant of the Lord is upon me because he has anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor. He sent me to proclaim liberty to the captives and recovering of sight to the blind, to set at liberty those who are oppressed." So literally Jesus' ministry was to set slaves free. And it's incredible. Now, Paul's description of the Christian community was this: there's neither Jew nor Greek, there's neither slave nor free, there's no male or female, for you're all one in Jesus Christ, which is an incredible vision of humanity. Now, the issue, of course, is why didn't Paul condemn slavery in the New Testament? Well, the issue is that in Rome, 85 to 90% of Roman society were slaves. And this would, if all of them were free, literally, Rome would have ended in chaos. And Rome would have swiftly and powerfully come in to abolish such an uprising. Instead, what the Bible did is it sowed the seeds of ultimate abolition of slavery by providing us an example of radically different community structure.
Now, we do need to be careful. That answer, of course, was significantly over time. I think, in fairness to the negative team, I'll allow them extra time now to respond, but we do need to try and keep the answers concise and directed to the question. So, the negative team.
A brief response. The word to Corinthianize in the Greek context meant to commit fornication, and so prostitution was widespread in Corinth when Paul of Tarsus decided to outlaw it in 1 Corinthians. So it seems that God is only partly able to set out his objective morality sometimes, but other parts of the Bible that are supposedly inspired seem to be up to humans and human interpretation, which at times has gone against the financial incentives of slave owners, and that's actually been a struggle for Christians to go and say that. One brief comment on the year of Jubilee. In Exodus 21, the book that starts with the Israelite people being taken out of slavery, it starts talking about Hebrew servants. It says, if you buy a Hebrew servant, he is to serve you for 6 years, but in the 7th year he will go free without paying anything. Now, critically, it goes on in verse 5 to say, if the servant should declare, I love my master, my wife, my children, I will not go out free. That is, if he has children and a wife, the slave owner is to take him to some judges, pierce his ear against a door, and he will serve forever. That's his entire life. So the year of Jubilee sounds like a good concession, but for any man who loves his wife, it doesn't seem to provide the concession of his own freedom. I'd argue that's immoral. Also, one other comment is in the time of Exodus, back in Exodus 12, verse 44, it says, everyone's servant who is bought for money after you've circumcised him may eat of the Passover meal. So the very significant festival of Passover that was meant to symbolize the Jews being free, the Israelites being freed from slavery under Egypt, is being allowed to the servants. So it seems rather insidious that they go from being slaves to now being slave masters. It really seems like they lack human empathy in that regard. Thanks.
All right. Now, the next question, this being a question for the negative team, why are you confident that the human mind is reliable in formulating accurate beliefs in areas far removed from our basic needs, such as cosmology, molecular biology, theoretical particle physics, and so on, and metaphysical realities, since our beliefs in those areas do not affect our survival in the immediate physical environment we find ourselves in?
So, is that on? Okay. So the question is, how did we evolve such big brains, or
no? The question is why. The question is, why are you confident that the mind is reliable in formulating accurate beliefs in cosmology, etc.?
Okay.
Since these areas don't affect our survival in the immediate physical environment?
Well, the short answer to that is they're not. Our minds aren't very reliable with these things. There are ways to get around the tendency of the human mind to form false beliefs, to jump to false conclusions, outlined in the various scientific methods that have been used throughout history, ways of double-blind testing so that the experimenter doesn't influence the results themselves. So there's ways of thinking about things which we've discovered that allows us to think more rationally and objectively, and that is what has allowed us to do that, I would argue, rather than what I would pose as a counter question is why our brains are so irrational if they were designed. I mean, if God, that would, to me, seem a really poor design flaw. Why is emotion so forefront in our thinking? Why do we keep jumping to false conclusions? If God designed us, surely He'd design us to be rational first.
All right, a response, please, from the affirmative team.
Yeah, really appreciate your response there. I guess the challenge that we have, of course, is that if we are on the whole quite rational in our thinking, this would undermine most, if not all, of science, or a lot of science. So that's a major issue. So effectively, we're pulling the foundation out of science itself. I guess the other major issue that I have is that that basically we've had some arguments put forward here tonight for reasons why we shouldn't believe in God, but then we've also had the reason that we're basically irrational. So on one hand, we're irrational, but we need to go home and actually think about how we can decide what's true. So there's a great problem here that we can't actually achieve the end that is being recommended. Now, if God does exist and that we've been made in His image, then we have reason to trust our thinking on the whole. And so it's not a case of being irrational. So we can trust, the majority of science. We can trust our thinking process. We can go away and think about what's true and come to real conclusions. We can conclude that the gods of Zeus are false gods, and we can also come to the conclusion that the God of the Bible is the true God. So I put forward to you that the rationality of the mind is much better based on the God of the Bible.
Now, it occurs to me that there might be a question that at least I'd like to ask of both teams that arises out of that question, and I'd be interested in both of your perspectives on it. Would it even be accurate to describe a scientific theory in cosmology or theoretical particle physics or something of the sort like that as a belief? Now, I wonder if people have thoughts about that.
Well, I'm happy to say something. It's quite fascinating that our mind actually seems capable of discerning the laws of physics and chemistry, and that's really a remarkable thing. And Paul Davies has commented along those lines. So whether or not it's a theory or a belief, I guess, depends on your presupposition. But if you assume that the mind is rational, and depending on the evidence, then we develop a theory. And often for scientists, they can believe certain things because it's their pet theory, but it doesn't mean that it's necessarily been established in that case. And there's a lot of areas like that, Stephen Hawking and so forth have put forward a lot of these sort of theories.
And the affirmative team?
I actually wanted to quote Richard Feynman: if you understand quantum mechanics, you don't understand quantum mechanics. You need a lot of minds, and you too should probably know this, being that you work in science, to collaborate to come to any real conclusion. You can't just do it on your own. Newton did it on his own, but he was probably a special case. And even then, he didn't always do it well on his own. He did sort of go down the route of alchemy and other things, which we now know is patently false. there are other issues with, I guess, the statement that we are infallible beings. We are, and you will admit that.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah,
Not
and we are. So that means we are irrational because infallibility implies irrationality.
All right, thank you for that. Could I ask the next question directed to the affirmative team? How do you know that God doesn't live on Kolob as the Mormons believe?
Yeah, well, this is an interesting epistemological question, and that's the whole issue. How do we know? And so with regard to issues regarding God, in my view, the only way that we can know is by revelation. So we have evidence from the existence of the world and so forth that I've presented that there's this conclusion that there must have been something else beyond us. But the other side of it is that we have a revelation through the Bible. Now, why can we trust the Bible? In my view, there are two reasons for this. One is that the Bible records some records of God speaking to people that revealed the future, and those prophecies were fulfilled. And from the research that I've done, there's historical evidence that those prophecies were written well before they occurred, and they were fulfilled later. In detail, and indeed encyclopedias and studies have been made on this. The other thing is the historical accuracy as we check the archaeological evidence. So where we can check the history, there's very good alignment. So again, I published in this area a book titled Unwrapping the Pharaohs, how Egyptian archaeology confirms the biblical timeline. So I believe that there is this evidence there, very, very strong evidence that the revelation in the Bible is in actual fact a revelation of God. But that I know of no other way that we can know where God lives.
All right, so revelation and trust of the Bible, what does the negative team say to that?
A few comments on that. So with some things like the Exodus, we seem to find a growing number of scholars who are Old Testament minimalists who see fairly little or no archaeological evidence for the existence of this widespread exodus. And in fact, looking at Egypt, which is one of Professor Ashton's interest areas, it seems that many of nearly all of the workers who were building the pyramids and making bricks for mastabas in some of these construction projects were paid workers. And in fact, one of the, I forget his name, but one of the chief architects was buried with several other architects inside several of the necropolises. There's graves built for the architects because the workers were seen as honourable people who were building up the posterity of the pharaohs. In one part of Ezekiel, in chapter 26, we see a prophecy of the
Could you hold the microphone closer to your face, please?
In chapter 26 of Ezekiel, we see a prophecy of the destruction of Tyre. It says that the entire rock will be wiped clean, the debris will be smashed off it, and nets will be cast over the entire area where the port used to be. Now, if you look up the city of Tyre in a Google image search, you'll see beautiful beaches, a lovely port, a great little Lebanese city. And so it seems like some of this prophecy isn't actually necessarily trustworthy. And so, you know, Kolob, if Joseph Smith comes along and he was a convicted con man, he comes along and says that he has these tablets, it doesn't really sound like that's necessarily that much more trustworthy or less trustworthy to me.
Can I reply to the
Yes, but keep it quick. We've got a lot of people.
Okay. My understanding from history is that when the people fled from Tyre to the island just offshore when Alexander the Great was approaching, and that he demolished the city to build a causeway out to take the island, and it was essentially scraped bare by his men. So.
All right. Thank you. Now we'll move to questions from the audience. Given that we have run over on that section of questioning between the two teams, what I'd like to propose is that each team gets only 1 minute to respond in the interests of trying to get through the long line of people that are waiting. So could I invite our first questioner to come forth and ask away?
Good evening. Question for our atheist friends. You mentioned about the Bible says that faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. If I say my car is white, I'm giving a description of my car, not a definition of my car. My car is a travelling machine, I suppose, a transportation device. It seems to me when the Bible says the faith is substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen, it's giving a description of faith, not a definition of faith. Could you possibly have misunderstood what the Bible is saying here? Please comment.
Sure. Obviously, that's not the only thing that faith is in the Bible. It also says that if you have faith as a mustard seed, you can say to a mountain, chuck yourself in the ocean, and it will. I don't see many mountains chucking themselves in the ocean. So did Christians just not test this out? Or, yeah, there are different definitions of faith. There's different sorts of faith. What I'm talking about is the faith that we get to when you shoot down every argument a Christian has, and at the end of it, they turn around and say, "Oh, it's just faith. I just know because of faith," and you can't touch that. That's the faith I was talking about, the evidence of things not seen.
The affirmative team. Again, 1 minute.
I think we all exercise faith in a wide variety of ways in every aspect of our lives. Even to trivial things like you sit down on a chair and you expect it to hold you because your experience has shown that thousands of times you've done this and it supports you. So we do actually live by faith all the time in all kinds of small ways. So the question really is, does the evidence support what we have placed our faith in? And my contention as a Christian is that the evidence indeed does support where I have put my faith. It always takes faith. You guys are exercising faith tonight in saying there's no God. I'm exercising faith in saying there is. But I think my position is stronger because the evidence that I see in the world around me supports the historicity of the biblical record and supports what I believe and what I read, which is revealed to me through the Bible.
Okay, my question is for our atheists. Thank you for pointing out that people do indeed trust doctors who work in mysterious ways. As someone who works in the medical field, I know that lots of people have no idea how doctors work, and to them it's mysterious. So my question is, how do you explain irreducible complexity? The human body, for instance, there are so many different systems, respiratory, reproductive, digestive, that are all interrelated, all codependent, the exception being reproductive. Without any of those working properly, you're either really ill or you're dead. So how do you explain that?
Okay, this is an example of, we've heard dozens of times tonight. It doesn't have a very flattering name. It's called an argument from ignorance. It is a known logical fallacy. Basically it goes, we don't know, therefore God. Or we don't know, therefore this. Just because you don't know how something evolved doesn't mean it didn't evolve. Just because you can't imagine how something happened doesn't mean that it has to be designed by God. It gives no evidence for God just because your imagination can't extend to how it happened, or just because we don't know. If you don't know something, you say, I don't know that. You don't say, I don't know, okay, God must have done it.
The affirmative team.
That has a colloquial name called God of the Gaps, kind of a belief. But in fact it isn't that at all, and as both myself and John have illustrated in our presentations, we believe what we believe because of the evidence, not in spite of the evidence. So it's not a question of what we don't know, we believe these things because we do know them. So the question was about irreducible complexity, and fundamentally it says that in almost any area of a living organism there are relationships which must all be in place simultaneously, initially, for that to have any effect or to be of benefit, or for the organism in fact to even live. And that mitigates powerfully against naturalistic explanations of origins, which can only happen through random processes, and there is no known evidence that shows all of those things could happen all at once. The probabilities are staggeringly against that.
Our next questioner.
My question is for the affirmative team. The Abrahamic God is frequently described as being omnipotent, omniscient, all-loving, eternal, ineffable, and unchanging, and unknowable. If the Abrahamic God is unknowable, how do we know that it's created the universe, that it is omnipotent, omniscient? How do we know anything at all about this Abrahamic God if it is in fact unknowable? And if we do know these other things about it, then it in fact is knowable.
It's a good question. I think the thing is, of course, that that's a little bit of a misrepresentation of the Abrahamic God, because the Bible says that God is knowable and that he has revealed himself to us. Now, certainly there might be aspects of God that are beyond our knowledge or beyond our ability to comprehend. That's fine. That's the whole definition of what God is. He's transcendent. But for him to be he is able, as the Bible says, to reveal himself. If he is a person, if he's an agent, he can reveal aspects of his existence to us, and that's what he has done in the Bible through the life of Jesus and the resurrection. So this concept of God being unknowable is actually not a biblical idea.
Could I invite the negative team to respond?
How do you know? And how do you know how the person who wrote those things about God knew? How do you, surely they're a person just like you and I. Surely they have no special powers of talking to God more than you or I. So when you go back to Bible writers, how do you know how they knew? You're trusting in their epistemology to say God is this. You can be pretty sure it's not as thorough as ours is in the modern world. So why would you trust the epistemology of ancient people to describe God for you? It makes no sense.
Thank you. Next questioner.
One thing I'd just like to say is in the New Testament, one of the things I absolutely love about Jesus Christ is that he preached about love. It's all about love and acceptance. Now, a question I do have on this topic is on the topic of ethics and objective morality.
And a question for which team?
I would like to start with the affirmative, if that's okay.
Mm-hmm.
What is objective morality? And if objective morality does exist, what is the point of empathy? If these two concepts coexist within our minds, is objective morality empathy? If these two concepts are not the same and coexist, then what is the point of empathy? So my question is, if we have objective morality, why do we have this God-given gift of empathy?
The affirmative team.
Basically, from the Christian biblical perspective, is that morality is not independent from God. Neither is it arbitrary, as Nick started off by pointing out in his presentation. Basically, morality is grounded in the goodness of God. So it flows out of his goodness and his love for all of us, and that's why we can be confident that it's objective. It's ontologically founded in him. Now, in terms of empathy, the fact is that empathy and love is something that just flows from God's nature. So we can have both morality, objective morality, coming from the nature of God, and also empathy as well. So I don't see any inconsistency in these two ideas.
And the negative team?
So we're fairly sure, based on evolutionary psychology, that empathy is necessary for the survival of any type of herd. We actually see this in dogs fairly frequently. There was recently last year in China, a dog crossing the road got hit. Another dog on the other side of the road, no possible relation, I don't think, actually ran out into traffic to try and save the dog. It then ran away, and they actually tried to find it because they wanted to interview it. But anyway, rather humorous. And we do see it in other animals as well. We see it in higher apes. They show empathy as well. empathy does seem to be something that evolves for animals that are pack animals such as ourselves, I guess, and animals that have communities.
But I don't think you've mentioned objective reality in responding to the question.
Objective morality, I don't think there is objective morality. There's fish that, well, if you look at the anglerfish, the male actually has to rape the female to have babies. There's no objective morality, unfortunately. We see that as wrong. They don't survive if they don't do it.
Next question.
This is addressed to Dr. Harwood. You state that we now live in the imperfect remains of a perfect creation. However, in Romans chapter 1, verse 20, St. Paul says, "Ever since the creation of the world, his invisible nature, namely his eternal power and deity, have been clearly perceived in the things that have been made." So according to St. Peter, we do still have at least perceptual access to God's imperceptible nature in all created things. My question then to you is, as a demonstration of God's existence, how do you recognize a perfect transcendent God in a fallen, imperfect, immanent creation? For example, can you describe the ontological relationship between God and something like genetic entropy? How are they ontologically compatible?
Okay, so Paul says this in Romans 1:20, and basically his point is that there is sufficient information available to us by observation of the world around us, such that man is without excuse in terms of his knowledge of the existence of God and God's divine qualities. But it doesn't allow us to see everything about God, simply because the world is a fallen, broken world. We see it's full of suffering, for instance, which has been raised a couple of times tonight. So our real understanding, therefore, our more complete understanding, comes from God's specific revelation of himself in his word. And as I mentioned right at the beginning of my talk, we can have confidence that his word is in fact the truth, the eyewitness account from the very beginning of all of history. So we can't learn all there is to know about God from observing the world, but we can discover that there is one, and man is without excuse, but it's from his specific revelation that we discover more of him.
Could I invite the negative team to respond?
So I actually think I addressed this in my talk. If we live in a fallen world, then God knew about Eve, that Eve was going to cause the fall. He could have stopped it. Any parent in the audience would stop their child from sticking their finger in a PowerPoint. Not stopping that is a heinous act, and you claim that God did that. So you are claiming that God is evil.
Well, I will allow a response to that. I noticed that you haven't used all your time, and perhaps we'll... No, hold on. I'm going to hear me out, because I'll come back to you.
In 30 seconds, God warned Adam of the consequences of his actions. We overlook so often that God made us in his image, meaning that we are free moral agents, we were made for relationship with him, and that is only possible if we have volition. So if you were pre-programmed so that you could do nothing but worship and love God, you could not be in meaningful relationship with him. So it had to be possible for Adam to rebel, but it was also possible for Adam not to rebel. So the fact that we're made in God's image is something that God has never violated. He's never gone back and reached in and just fixed everything up arbitrarily.
And could I offer you another 30 seconds, please?
Made in God's image, are we invisible? I don't even know what that means, and I defy you to know what that means either. Hang on, what was the question? Okay, so exactly. The tree was of the knowledge of good and evil. So if they hadn't eaten from the tree, how could they know that they shouldn't eat from the tree? If they don't know that it's wrong to eat from the tree before they do that, and
I think the former speaker said
But
something.
they did, because God told them. He warned them as a loving father
but
would
how
warn.
could they know that it's wrong?
Because God warned them as a loving father would warn his child.
All right.
Okay.
All right. I'm deeply tempted to ask about the existence of Adam. There are many Christians who would accept that Adam never existed at all. And I'm curious as to what the affirmative team would say to that.
Well, I mean, that's what the Bible says as a revealed word, and it's very consistent with a lot of science that we have. I think it's a very logical explanation. Creation has to have occurred in a very, very short period of time because of ecological problems that we have. So, to me, the biblical account it fits the evidence that we have very well. Short time span, God created people, and so name Adam. Yeah.
And again, I'm diverting things, but could I ask the negative to respond briefly?
I think it's only a short time span because you want it to be a short time span. But anyway. What was the other bit? Sorry, I missed the other bit you said. The existence of Adam. So, yeah, there are a lot of religions that don't agree with the existence of Adam. If Noah's Ark existed, was it 4,000 years ago, then all species would have had to have fit on that, and it's just not possible unless you accept some evolution from that point, and there's not enough time to do that, so we've got a problem with your hypothesis, which isn't a theory, but hypothesis.
I didn't want to divert things from our audience speakers. Could I invite the next questioner?
Thank you to both teams. It's been a really thought-provoking discussion tonight. My question is to our atheist friends. Do you believe that it's logical to risk your life to save a stranger? And if you do believe that it is logical, then how does naturalism and survival of the fittest fit in with that? And if you don't believe that it's logical, then do you believe in the existence of completely selfless love, and can you account for it? Sorry, that was a long question.
That's a good question. The negative team?
So we see throughout the animal kingdom there's altruism in higher primates, and part of the human brain and the brain of higher primates is that they're actually able to model the behaviour and the actions and the emotional states of other people. So if one person starts yawning, many other people start yawning. If you show bonobos a video of a human yawning, they start yawning. So the interesting thing is emotional transmission through to different people. Our prosocial behaviour does have evolutionary roots, and it's a very big problem in the world of mirror neurons show us that we have the ability to model other people's behaviour in order to learn from them. The interesting thing is they put a monkey in a MRI machine, and if a human comes in and starts opening up a peanut and shelling it, the monkey starts lighting up the same neurons in the way that they would if they were actually shelling the peanut. So seeing another person's behaviour lets even monkeys and groups from different species be able to model our own behaviour, and that's a big part of altruism.
The affirmative team.
Well, I think that animals were actually made to be our friends and to bring pleasure to us, the whole world originally, in this sense, in terms of this. So obviously they would have certain characteristics. But I think the ability to give your life for someone else stems from a God-given love, really, that everybody has. Just like everybody has a conscience, some people deny that, and I see this as part of the image of God in us, thankfully.
Well, I see that someone wants to ask a question. Keep it very short.
I take some umbrage with animals were made for our pleasure. You realise that there are animals that burrow out of people's eyes. There are diseases, there are pathogens. I'm sure there's actually some medical people in the audience who will talk about some animals.
Yeah, okay. I said they were made that way, but sin has then had its plan from that way. It's fallen world. So that's my view of it.
How do you know?
All right. Could I ask our next questioner?
Thank you. Two brief points for the affirmative team. Secular attestations of Jesus are often used to avoid the circular reasoning of using the Gospels for the existence of Jesus. That's valid to the extent that Sign of the Four is evidence for Sherlock Holmes' existence, but anyway. How do you respond to that? And the issues with the secular attestations are well known, so why do they continue to get raised? The Josephus passage looks to be an interpolation since it breaks up the narrative. The Tacitus passage is too late not to be influenced by preaching, and the Suetonius passage is in the wrong life. If this is going to agree with the 33 date, it should be in the life of Tiberius and is in the life of Claudius. Excuse me. So how do you respond to that? There are multiple issues with those. So why do you continue to raise them as evidence?
So basically what we're looking at here is how do we determine what is historical? And for this issue, we need to approach it like an ancient historian would. And what we have here is any historian would be looking for the sources of information about a person or event, and then actually constructing the best explanation for that event as well. And so what we have here is a number of different testimonies about the life of Jesus. We have the letters which refer to Jesus as well. And we also have the external evidence from Josephus and Tacitus just mentioned as well as... the issue here, of course, is that the historian can construct what actually happened based on that information. And it's basically impossible for historians to do their work if they have this fundamental skepticism with all of the sources that they have. So basically they need to approach their work from a historical perspective.
Okay, Josephus was 95 CE, and it's not even clear that he was referring to Jesus of Nazareth. And even if he was, it's hearsay. He's heard it from a Christian, and he's writing about what he's heard. It's not evidence. I don't even know where to start with this. I've got a video on YouTube, which is on Sydney Atheist channel, which addresses all the historicity claims. But basically, Paul was the first New Testament writer. Never wrote about a historical Jesus. It never mentions a historical Jesus. Never quotes Jesus once, his supposed saviour. Never it talks about any events in the life of Jesus. Sorry, was that time?
No, you've got 20 seconds before we go to the
so
wrap-up.
If he's the first, and he even says about the Eucharist, the beginning of the breaking the bread and the wine and everything. He says that he received it from revelation, not that it was a practice among Christians at the time. None of this makes any sense if Jesus was a historical figure.
All right. Thank you. We have run out of time for more Q&A, which is a great pity because there were a long line of people who wished to ask some questions. Could we move now to the 5-minute closing statements and I'd invite the affirmative team to give a 5-minute closing statement.
In tonight's debate, it is clear the question of whether God exists or not is something of significant interest and importance. Of course, you're here tonight to prove that, or demonstrate that point, I should say. If God does not exist, then life has no ultimate meaning, purpose, or hope. Life will end individually for us all at our own death and universally at the heat death of the universe. There'll be no ultimate justice for any injustices, crimes, or moral monstrosities that have been committed. Ultimately, everything will end in nothing. However, if God does exist, then we have the wonderful opportunity to build a relationship with the creator of the universe and consequently to have the confidence of being resurrected from the dead to experience eternal life with him. Thus, whether God exists or not is tremendously significant for each one of us personally. Tonight we've been exploring the evidence for whether God actually exists, and the atheist team invited us to follow the evidence where it leads. And our Christian team has presented 5 key reasons for believing in God. The first reason comes from the origin of the universe. The beginning of the universe points towards an immaterial, uncaused, enormously powerful and personal creator of the universe. And basically we haven't really heard any alternative concept from the atheist side on that point. The second reason for the existence of God is from the origin of life itself and the existence of coded information in DNA for which there is no conceivable naturalistic explanation. Any argument that assumes a naturalistic explanation is really just an evolution of the gaps argument. Thirdly, we have identified that the human mind, which includes consciousness and rationality, provides evidence for the existence of God as our intelligent creator. If our cognitive faculties were produced by naturalistic evolution, then we have very little reason to trust our own cognitive faculties in areas that bear little to survival, just like metaphysical beliefs. And the atheist team agreed on this point. Hence, naturalistic evolution is self-refuting. Thus, our own rationality provides strong evidence for the existence of God, and it is actually irrational to hold the atheistic position. Fourthly, the existence of objective moral values and duties point towards the existence of God as the ontological foundation, the grounds of morality. And here the atheists agree with us that if God does not exist, then there are no objective moral values and duties. But the fact is that love and compassion and tolerance are genuinely good. And to hold a young girl in a dungeon for 10 years and sexually abuse her is truly evil. To gang rape a woman is truly evil. So, all of the moral issues that the atheists have raised, such as the problem of evil and any apparent difficulty with Old Testament morality, requires an objective morality to critique it. So to ensure that the issue is not just groundless. Hence, these issues have been raised by atheists are actually, as I said before, backhanded evidence for the existence of God. Finally, the historical evidence for the resurrection of Jesus points directly to the existence of God. The atheist contentions that the New Testament accounts are simply mythical constructions from pagan mystery religions or are not historically reliable go against all of the conclusions of the majority of respected ancient historians. And here we had affirmed that the Gospel of Mark was produced within 30 years of Jesus' death and resurrection. And we have Paul as well, who wrote his letters within 17 years, within 20 years. Instead of the resurrection of Jesus is the best explanation for the historical facts that we observed. I'd like to conclude our presentation tonight by highlighting the reality that God is not just an idea, but a person who's chosen to reveal himself to us through Jesus Christ. Having presented to you substantial evidence that God does exist, I would like to invite you to read through one of the Gospels, accounts of the life of Jesus, and ask yourself, could it be true that the God revealed in the life of Jesus is a person who's able to give me hope, meaning and purpose for my life right now and the promises of eternal life? I know that some of you here tonight may have been hurt by religion, but I would like to point out that Jesus himself was hunted down and crucified by the religious leaders of his day. I invite you not to explore human religion, but the person of Jesus Christ. My life has been transformed by Jesus, and I invite you to experience the difference that Jesus can make in your life.
And could I invite the negative team to present their concluding remarks?
I'm sorry, none of us got round to preparing one, so this is going to be pretty random. Now, we haven't heard a single shred of evidence. We've heard supposedly 5 reasons, but they haven't given us any evidence. Until there's evidence, surely there's no reason to accept the existence of something. Now, first reason that they gave was if there's no God, then there's no ultimate meaning or justice or anything. So that's wishful thinking. If there was, then this would be good, and we want this, so therefore God must exist because that's what we want to happen. That is wishful thinking, nothing more. Now, you talk about the origins of life, the origins of the universe. We can't explain it, therefore God must exist because he must have done it. Saying that God did it adds nothing to our understanding. How did God do it? Why did God do it? When did God do it? If there's a stage and something magically appears on the stage, we can all look at it and say, that's magic. Why does it make it any more or less explicable if there's a magician on the stage? Magic has happened. it makes no sense. Adding a magician doesn't add anything to our understanding of what has occurred. The rational mind argument, that we have rational minds, we have minds that are somehow capable of rationality. I wouldn't say that we have rational minds, and I think that serves as more of an indictment on the affirmative team's case than on ours, that we don't have rational minds, that we have minds that evolve imperfectly. Objective morality, I actually disagree with Morgan here. I think there is such a thing as objective morality. It depends how you define the morality, though. If you define good as human flourishing, then you can quite easily say that something is objectively good or objectively bad. And you don't need any concept of God in order to do that. You can use science to do that. Now, talking about the majority of biblical scholars saying that Jesus existed, the majority of biblical scholars are Christians. So, of course, they're going to say that Jesus existed. Now, in terms of historians, ancient historians take the view that if something is written about someone in ancient history, then it is more logical to just assume that person existed, because thousands of people existed in ancient times that we have nothing written about. That is the strength of the case for the existence of Jesus in ancient times. That's pretty much it. The Bible actually has more evidence against the existence of Jesus once we understand when each book was written and who it was written by. It shows that the only way to make sense of the Bible and how it was written is to say that Jesus didn't exist. That the idea of a historical Jesus was invented by Mark, the first gospel writer. And we know from studying the Bible that Matthew copied from Mark, and so did Luke, and John was so far after that you know, he had no access to eyewitnesses or anything anyway. That's about it, isn't it? Have we got any other? No. Thank you.
Just two minor housekeeping announcements. The first is there'll be some refreshments outside here at the conclusion of this evening. The second is not expecting the caterers would be late. I understand the Sydney Atheists have organised a get-together at the Cabana Bar, Christie Street, St Leonard's, a little later this evening. Those two housekeeping matters said, the time comes to formally wrap up the debate. Firstly, I hope that all who have been listening, or at least that some who have been listening, whether here in the audience or online, have found something thought-provoking in what has been said, what has been exchanged between these two teams. Once again, I'd like to thank all of the people who organised this evening and the great turnout that we had. Could you put your hands together for them? And could you also put your hands together to our debaters? And thank you. That's the conclusion of proceedings this evening.